And if anyone's had a sprained ankle, you don't walk normally, do you? You limp. Why? Because it hurts to walk on it. All right, you try and do everything to avoid the pain. Put it up, ice it, anything. You just don't want to walk on your sprained ankle. Well, if you're emotionally hurt, if you're emotionally sprained, if you suffer trauma, then you don't want to do anything to feel the trauma. You want to numb out.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations with firsthand insights from the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm Dominic Lawson. Virtual intensive outpatient programs can provide flexibility for many in recovery due to busy schedules or not being comfortable physically being around other people. Josh Ulrich, virtual therapist of the Meadows Outpatient Center's MBH Connect, says that it's important to meet people where they are in order to put them on the right path to recovery. But if you choose a virtual option, could you be sacrificing care for the sake of convenience? Let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
My name is Josh Ulrich, and I am the therapist, a virtual therapist for Meadows Behavioral Program at the virtual IOP. I have an LPC, so I'm independently licensed. I also have a CSAT, which is Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. And I'm happy to be here on this podcast.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh, for coming on the Beyond Theory podcast. So just kind of start with your background, if you would.
I am kind of a non-traditional background. So I went to college at UC Santa Barbara, great school, fun, beaches. And I got my master's in East Asian Studies, minor in Japanese. I wanted to do business and sales. Father was a salesman, grandfather was a salesman. I was always told that the best thing to separate yourself in the business world is to have something unique that most people don't have. So everyone has a business degree, but not everyone has like an East Asian Studies or a language degree. So I decided to focus on that. I did sales for about 10 years, got burnt out because you're only as good as your last month. And my wife suggested that I get into counseling. I'm really good with people. I like being around people. I love listening. And that was always the most fun part about sales, was working with individuals and really to find out what are their needs, what are their wants. I then got my master's in mental health counseling at Argosy University. And while I was there, I did my internship at Hospice of Arizona. I think they got bought out right now by Hospice of the Valley. So Hospice of Arizona. And so for a full year, I worked with those that were actually dying, because you have to have less than 6 months to live being hospice. I also worked with the family members of those that died. In hospice, we like to use the word death, died, not just passed away, better life, etc. After that, I then got a job at Gila River Indian Reservation in their behavioral health department. Those of you in Arizona, that's in good old Sacaton, south of the 202. Those are the international or national. It's one of the largest reservations in Arizona. There's 30,000 members of the Pima Maricopa as the primary tribe in Gila River. And they have their own behavioral health department. And I worked there in counseling, did a little case management. The clients I had were kids, children. I had some like 2-year-old patients. And then I also had elders. So an elder is anyone 55 or older. So I had a lot of those elders, patients. And the traumas they experience, a lot of generational traumas. You've been hearing the news about the boarding schools. So a lot of the grandparents, elders would have gone to those boarding schools, dealt with them and the repercussions of their sons, daughters, and then of course the grandkids. And a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol. So I worked with that. After about 7 years, I got a offer to work at the Meadows Behavioral Health at the IOP in Scottsdale, Arizona. I worked there for 3.5 years. The first 2, I was working in the Claudia Black IOP, which is the CBC. It's a young adult group, and that's for 18 to 26-year-olds. First 6 months I was there, it was a co-ed group. Then, unfortunately, as you might know, 18 to 26-year-olds tend to be a little more romantically involved than they should, especially in a treatment program. So we broke that off into just men only and women only. And so I run the men's group. About after 2 years, we decided to, integrate the young adults into the regular group system. I ran for 6 months our standard co-ed group, working with the Meadows model. After about 6 months, I then was offered a position running the men's sex addiction group because I was starting to get my CSAT certificate, which is Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. The reason for that is for a lot of young adults, if you're 18, 19, 20 years old, the question always arises, are you a sex addict, porn addict, or are you just hypersexualized? Is it society? Is it, what's going on? So there's that gray area. And since that's who I was primarily working with, they wanted to have me get trained, and I also wanted to train in that. So as I was getting trained in the sex addiction therapy, position opened up in the Gentle Path IOP, which is the men's sex addiction group. I joined that in March of 2020, so right before the pandemic, and did that for an entire year. Ran that group, got my license, CSAT, and then I was offered the position for the virtual IOP. Been running that group, our Arizona morning group, since March of this year. And now I'm on the podcast with you.
Yeah, and we're so glad that you are on the Beyond Theory podcast with us. I really appreciate you sharing your background. I want to go back to a few things you talked about in your background. Particularly, you talked about working with the Native American population for a while there. I'm curious, were there anything that was kind of eye-opening for you working with that population in regards to mental health?
Yes. What was eye-opening was, one, you hear the term generational trauma, and I can't tell from my name. I'm a white middle-aged man, so I'm definitely not one who's in the generational trauma demographic. So I hear that, going to school and so forth, and I'm wondering, really, is it true? Is it not? You can kind of read in books. But to see it and see actually how it works, when you have the young, men and women, the boys, the girls, who were taken from their home and taken to these boarding schools, and what they really were re-education camps. And I use camps in the wrong word because a lot of people think of the Holocaust or some other stuff, and it's not camps, but they're re-education schools. And that is, their hair's cut, they can't learn their language, they can't dress, and a lot of corporal punishment, for failing to follow the rules. And they go through that trauma. And then when they become adults, they leave the schools and then go back to their reservation, to their homes. And if anyone has suffered trauma, what you do is you have pain. And I like to equate to a sprained ankle. And if anyone's had a sprained ankle, you don't walk normally, do you? You limp. Why? Because it hurts to walk on it. All right? You try and do everything to avoid the pain. Put it up, ice it, anything. You just don't want to walk on your sprained ankle. Well, if you're emotionally hurt, if you're emotionally sprained, if you suffer trauma, then you don't want to do anything to feel the trauma. You want to numb out. Well, so you drink alcohol, back in the 40s, 50s. Well, if you've only learned how to raise people by beating, by not being there emotionally, by being shut off, by developing walls, and your only coping skill is alcohol, then when you have children, what are you doing? You're raising them that way. And the children grow up during the 60s and 70s, and they're exposed to drugs, whether it's marijuana and other more powerful drugs. And of course, they're being raised, mom raised me with being walls, no emotions, beatings. And then I have kids, and how am I going to raise them? Same thing. I'm drugs, I'm not there, I'm, alcohol, drugs, no affection, don't really know how to relate, and I'm trying to numb out from my own pain of childhood, and I'm now your parent, and so you have three, then you get to fourth generations of people with systemic addiction and pain and improper or unhealthy parenting skills and unhealthy ways of communicating love, affection. And so that has become a generational trauma, and the idea is to try and block that as much as you can. It's hard when you're dealing with a 14-year-old that's living with their grandparents who still has poor parenting experience. So how do you try and break that trauma? Now, I do want to codify this or say my experience. I remember asking my supervisor, because they said I didn't want to have a bad view of the Gila River Indian Reservation. I don't want to sit there and go like, not every single person we treat has, alcohol or addiction or any problems. He said, no. And I said, about roughly how many are we treating? He said, about 20, 30% of the population. So just to let you know that as I'm saying this, not every single person in Gila River is an alcoholic. Not every single person has suffered trauma. Not every single person has done all this stuff, or has been a bad parent, or has had problems or issues, or any criminal activity. It's a smaller population, but it's very common throughout the Native American history. So I just like to say that because I don't want anyone, I'm painting a broad brush here.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So that was my experience. That awakened it. And really it came down to the biggest story for me changed was you're planting seeds because, and you hear it now when we talk with other patients at the Meadows, how you have to work with families and change the family dynamics because, as I said, I had a 14, 15-year-old who was in juvenile court, had to be sober, had marijuana, had an alcohol problem, was starting to get into meth. And he asked me, how do I stay sober? My dad's smoking. My mom is drinking. My grandparents drink. Everyone drinks. Everyone uses. And that's where I'm going to go home to. Like, how do I stay sober when they're offering me alcohol, when they're offering me drugs? And so that was one of those things, realizing that you have to give people, especially young people, the tools that when they turn 18 or when they get to a point where they can break away or they can say no and leave the toxic environment, they have the tools to succeed. But sometimes those family systems are so ingrained that you're not going to get immediate results. But it's really important to work on the family system because just giving one person treatment, I don't care whether it's the Meadows inpatient, where you have incredible treatment, but if you put them back into a toxic environment, a family system that belittles them, is negative, is counterintuitive to everything they've learned, the 45 days of treatment doesn't do anything. The 90 days doesn't do anything. It gives them a little bit of tools, but the family system, the environment has to change if you want anything long term.
Thank you for sharing that. And now you're here at the Meadows, and you've been doing some great work here at the Meadows, and now you're part of the VOIP program. Kind of talk about that experience there so far.
Well, what a unique experience because virtual IOP, you have group, it's a setting. You're interacting with a therapist and other people in group. But instead of being in a room and have like 8, 9 chairs, you have a monitor. You're either on your phone, looking at the camera, or you've got a desktop and a webcam. And so you see the people, but again, you're not interacting. You can't smell, see, you don't, get all the different touch and feel. And the key is to make it real, to really get that vulnerability. And what I learned was I took my experience with the young adults at CBC. I took my experience with the GP, sex addiction, and even the general to realize that, kind of a side note here, Adam Savage from Mythbusters, I saw a YouTube clip before I took the VLP job. And someone asked him, are you really that nuts? Are you really that crazy in real life? He's like, no, I'm a really calm person. But he realized on TV, you have to amp it up like good 30%. So whoever you are, take it like 30%. And he said, when you're doing the video, like a YouTube, you only need to do it 5%, maybe 10%. So I took that to heart when I took the job. And I realized that you have to give more energy, just like I'm dealing with the like 18, 20 or 26-year-olds, because they'll just totally sleep on you. So you have to like give energy, be a little bit of performance, so it's not static. You need to give tasks. You need to be educational, and you need to be engaging. And the fact is, by giving that energy to a camera, to a screen, it allows people to kind of drop off and kind of forget that I'm just in a virtual environment, that you're really not here. So that's the ultimate thing, what I learned and I worked on. But the main difference is it really is pretty much the standard group. I mean, we have check-ins. People talk about what's going on. People checking on their anxiety, depression. They share their stories. They share good stories, bad stories, what they ate last night, movies, sports. They connect. People share their emails and phone numbers and contact each other after, just like a normal group, and be supportive. And the benefit of the virtual, even though the downside, again, you can't just go grab a coffee during break. You know, benefit is I'm reaching out to someone right now. We're in Arizona, so I know someone in Tucson, or maybe I know someone in Flagstaff, or maybe someone in Globe or Bisbee, or all over the state. And either I can't travel because I've got immune deficiencies, maybe I need a liver transplant, or got some other disease, or I can't travel because my anxiety is too much, or my depression is too much to get out of bed, or I work at a job where I can only get maybe 2-3 hours free. It would be 3 hours for the program. So I'm able to still engage, reach out, see other people, and hear their stories. And the magic part about group is, it was just you and I doing a individual session, and I tell you you're doing a great job. I say, good job. I like what you're doing. Look at the strengths there. Look at all the trauma you've been able to, get over. Well, not get over, but process. And you've been able to get out of bed. You're doing self-care. You've been sober for X number of days. Really good job. You, in the back of your mind, go, you know what? I'm paying this guy. I mean, he's my therapist, but I'm paying him. Maybe I'm paying him to say good things. Or if I'm critical, and I say, I'm not going to meetings. You're not talking to your sponsor. I don't see you putting a lot of effort into this. You can go, whatever, I don't like you. I'll go somewhere else. But when you have a group and you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 other people all say good things about you, and the same good things, or they all say the same critical stuff about you, it's kind of hard to ignore. You can't say these, group of people are being paid to say nice things about you. And you also can't say these group of people have it in for you. I mean, you could, but it really breaks down those walls of denial. So it helps reinforce a lot of the therapeutic information and the process that you go through. So the group is much more powerful. And you can still get that amazingly with a camera. Yes.
Gotcha. No, I was just say real quick, seems like it also adds that extra layer of accountability as well.
Yeah, it does. The amazing thing is, if you're in a physical group setting, you can always sit there and claim, I got a flat tire. I'm sick, migraine, kid's sick, can't do this. Lots of excuses not to get in group. Lots of excuses not to actually be involved. This one, you have your phone. Your kid's sick, you can still do it. Migraine, turn the light off. You're still in group. I don't need to have a working car to do group. So I've been having much higher success of people attending, simply for the fact that there's no excuse not to. Like, why can't you attend? Unless you're physically not going to be in the state, there's really no reason you can't. Which is great, because then you reach people where they're at, they're in home, they're in their life, and you also get to, they get to buy into the program, and they're in it longer for a sustained amount of time for more intensity. So I find that it's much more effective. You lose a little bit of the human contact, but you can make it up through the presentation and through activities and just through the brutal honesty and vulnerability of the people in the group.
I appreciate you saying that, because I was interested in that part as far like, how do you make up for that lack of not being face to face, especially with everything going on. So I appreciate that insight. One of the things I think that you guys do at Virtual IOP that's really amazing is that you have this rotating 8-week curriculum, which means that newcomers can kind of join at any point of the process. Why was that important to have that as part of the process for the program?
Well, I'd love to take credit for that, but that's something that Jim and Claudia Black developed for the IOPs. So we just took the in-person and put it into virtual. All right, so there's the credit. The reason for that is, if you're going to have if you have a closed group, you have to restart it every 8 weeks, 10 weeks. Or if it's completely closed, then members can leave, and it doesn't work very well. So if you have an open group, people come in, come out. What do you talk about? One of the big, we can get into the answer here. One of the big complaints I've heard people come to group is, I've gone to other treatment centers, and it doesn't seem like they have a plan. Does it seem like they're like, why are we doing this? What are we doing? Do we have any assignments? Do we have anything we're talking about? It just ends up being a giant process group, which people just sit there and just talk, which is good, except if I can just go to group and for the next 6, 7, 8 weeks complain about the same thing over and over and over again and never feel like I've gotten any help or been called out or need to change, what do I get out of that, process? So by having a dedicated 8 weeks topic, we're able to cover all the major issues that someone needs or to have a much more successful life and to be sober and happier and better through their treatment process. The 8 week process, okay, so a quick over what the 8 weeks are, then I'll explain how they work if you got time.
Sure.
Week 1 is boundaries communications. 2 is trauma. 3 is shame and vulnerability. Week 4 is addictions. Week 5 is mood disorders. Week 6 is grief and loss. Week 7 is emotions. And then week 8 is recovery management. On a side note, the reason why allowing it, rotating people to come in and out, again, if I start week 8, recovery management, I'm still going to get everything and learn by the time I get to week 7. If I come into week 2, trauma, I'll get everything and end on week 1, boundaries. I still get all the information. It may not be the nice week 1, but I'll still get everything and it builds upon itself. So anything I feel like I may be missing or gaps, it will be covered. So after 8 weeks, I will have full knowledge that whether anyone starts at week 1 or week 8 will have. The way it works, real quick, boundaries communications. So when someone violates your boundaries, that's physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, like the verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, that can cause trauma. Also communication. So again, if someone's just putting you down, saying that you're nothing, you're worthless. So week 2 is trauma. So again, we will learn about the trauma. What has happened? How does the trauma affect you chemically, neurochemically, physiologically, socially? And then if you suffer trauma, then it leads to you having shame and vulnerability. Usually you have shame over the trauma you've had. You are either invulnerable because you've had to put up walls to deal with the trauma and deal with the lack of boundaries, or you have no boundaries and you're extremely vulnerable because you had so much trauma. And then that leads to addiction. As I said, you have pain because, again, shame, vulnerability, you're in pain, you're raw, you've had trauma, your lack of boundaries or unhealthy boundaries, inability to communicate your thoughts and feelings. So you're now using either chemical addictions, behavioral addictions, could be gambling, could be porn, could be video gaming. Then that can also lead to mood disorders, which is week 5. Mood disorders will be depression, anxiety. Again, you're depressed about what's happened, anxiety about what could happen. Then that goes to grief and loss because you start to realize, what did you lose? You lose, your childhood. You lost your innocence. Maybe you've lost jobs. What has the addiction cost you? What has your major depressive disorder have done throughout your life? And then it goes to week 7, which is emotions, which is now you have to connect to your emotions. You've learned about grief and loss. You've identified your traumas. You understand how addiction works and how it's affecting your mood disorders. And now you need to connect with emotions because maybe you only have anger or you only have sadness. So what other emotions? We have many emotions. PMLE talks about we have at least 8 primary emotions. But between the 8, we have even multiples within there. And then finally, after you connect with your emotions, understand, the trauma, the grief, loss, and boundaries, you now can do recovery management, which means you can now work on what is your plan to stay sober, to stay healthy, to get out of bed, to do self-care, to know who to call if you think about doing any self-harm. And so that's how the 8-week program works.
You mentioned video gaming, and I know in my prep I saw that you're a gamer, I'm a gamer, and when we met for the first time at our sales meeting not too long ago, you talked about this story about a young lady who was on Twitch. Could you share that story with us here on Beyond Theory?
Yes, I can. And first, shout out Atari 2600, old school dude, like 5 man playing Pac-Man. They got to plug what I've done. I've had Atari 2600. NES, Sega Genesis. I became a Sega man, so I had Sega Genesis, Sega Saturn, Dreamcast. Then I got like an Xbox, PlayStation 4, Wii. Now I got a Switch because I got the little ones.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So yeah, gaming. Never got into computer. Never had a fast enough break. All right. So enough on me.
Gotcha.
What was really nice to talk about virtual, where people can participate in group therapy that wouldn't normally be able to participate. I had a young one. She was in her 20s, early 20s, and she was a gamer. She actually did Twitch. She did other type of streaming services, but I think Twitch was her primary income. She also suffered from severe anxiety, social anxiety. She couldn't leave the house. She'd been a lot of trauma growing up, a lot of relationship trauma when she's gotten out, as far as dating and being with men. So it made her want to isolate and just only engage with those online. It was interesting when we saw her. She had her whole gaming chair, the headset, 2 monitors, and so she had everything set up. She was there not for any drugs or alcohol. She had used some stuff in the past, but it really was the debilitating depression and anxiety. And because of that, she didn't want to go seek any type of therapy, couldn't get out of the house, couldn't go to a group setting, but she could do the virtual. She'd been in therapy for at least since she was like 12. So she's had a lot of therapy. She knew, the ins and outs, and probably could have a master's in it. So by the time she got in a group, she started to make connections because she was able to actually interact with other people around and hear stories of other people that have had abuse, that have had poor relations, that have anxiety, that have depression. And she started to make those connections to the point that when she had battles of depression and it was so bad she couldn't get out of bed, instead of getting in her gaming chair, she just grabbed her phone and just did it from her bed. And we did, and she also had migraines. So sometimes she'd be doing it with the lights off. But she was always aware. She was always present. She always talked. She even got into an accident, got her leg sliced. But she was able to come back the next day, showed us the stitches, and kept going. When normally that would have been an excuse not to go to an outside therapist or outside group. When she left, she stated she got more out of this group experience than she did in all the individual therapies and other treatment centers before, because she was able to develop real connection, and it was always there. It was something she knew she could always wake up to. It would get her out of bed. It was a reason to wake up. It was a reason to connect. And she would able to hear voices. Our group is co-ed, so she heard male voices, female voices. So she was able to process a lot of the relationships issues she's had, both from trauma from other females, trauma from other males, and as social anxiety. She did get out. She was able to start, working on getting back into employment. I'd love to say we cured her social anxiety. We did, but we definitely made a huge impact, and she enjoyed the whole process, and it meant a lot to her. The fact that she never gave up, never wanted to give up, and she always contributed. So it was a neat experience.
Thank you for sharing that story, Josh, because I'm curious, because I imagine there are some people who say, video game, whatever, or anything with depression or anxiety due to video games. I imagine sometimes there's a stigma there that that's not a real thing. You know what I mean? So I appreciate you kind of sharing that with that story, Josh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, gaming, like anything, can become an addiction. It can be a game. I think there was a story of people in the Southeast Asia. There was a typhoon coming in. They're still doing their gaming. But it's also a way of connecting, being with others. There's, groups, chat groups, the teams that you go on. But again, that's usually through avatars. You may or not really see someone. And the difference is you're doing an activity. I mean, same thing of going outside and playing ball. You can sit there and have your, we play hoop with, it connects, but it's not the same as sitting down and really talking about all the crap that's going on in your life and what you've done and why you can't drink or why you can't use or what's happened when you're your age or what happened, how someone passed away. That's a different connection. So there's nothing wrong with gaming. It's very healthy. But the fact that the virtual allows someone who's used to that format to get the connection they need to process their trauma is huge.
I hope you are enjoying this great conversation with Josh Ulrich, a virtual therapist at Meadows Behavioral Healthcare. Join us next week when we continue our conversation, this time discussing how to deal with grief and loss. Beyond Theory is produced and hosted by me, Dominic Lawson. You can discover more, including videos of some of our conversations, at beyondtheory.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you join us next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.